The smash hit musical Hamilton asks us to wonder who lives, who dies, who tells your story? We rely on someone's writings to tell us their stories. For some, like Hamilton, they are essays. For others, diaries. Still others, plays. And for a few, like Emily Dickinson, they are poems. Perhaps this poem can give us a small part of her story.
I had a daily bliss, I half indifferent viewed, till sudden I perceived it stir. It grew as I pursued, till when, around a crag, it wasted from my sight, enlarged beyond my utmost scope. I learned its sweetness right.
Oh, but wait, I thought this was that poem. I had a daily bliss, I half indifferent viewed, till sudden I perceived it stir. It grew as I pursued, till when around a height it wasted from my sight, increased beyond my utmost scope, I learned to estimate. Why are there two obviously different versions of the exact same poem? It all comes down to the editing process. When relying on one's writings to tell their stories, we all start with the same original, the manuscript, and we transcribe it before going into any analysis. And during transcription, changes are made, whether accidental or purposeful, and new stories are born. So, what is Emily Dickinson's story? Who gets to tell it? For this project, I've used the Emily Dickinson archive to trace the two versions of the poem I Had a Daily Bliss that still exist today. I chose these versions out of all the different anthologies that exist because they make specific editorial changes to I Had a Daily Bliss. There are dozens of different publications of this poem, but they all tend to follow one of these main versions, and only these make any major editorial changes. It's not a secret to those who have looked at Emily Dickinson's manuscripts that her handwriting is not the easiest to decipher. This manuscript, written around 1865 and accessed through the Emily Dickinson archive, is her draft of I Had a Daily Bliss. Since the vast majority of her writings were not discovered until after her death, Dickinson made no changes to this poem, and there are no alternatives suggested in her notes. Mabel Loomis Todd spent years going through Dickinson's poems, using a strong editorial hand to guide them into initial publication. I Had a Daily Bliss, which Todd gave the name Last Joy, was published in 1896 in Poems' third series. Todd's notes and editorial changes are accessible through the Emily Dickinson archive. Todd made some blatant and obvious changes to the original manuscript, most of which are in the second stanza. Other, more subtle changes include adding in commas and other punctuation, most likely to make the poem seem more readable. However, the main focus here is the second stanza, where words were crossed out from the original transcription and replaced with those that are not even variations of Dickinson's original words. The first major change was changing height to crag. Todd may have done this to make the poem seem more concrete, leaving less room for interpretation, as a crag is a cliff face and a height could be anything. The same reasoning applies to the second major change, which was changing the word increased to enlarged. Increased could mean increased in number or increased in size, whereas enlarged focuses on size alone. The last change in the second stanza are her edits to the last line, crossing out to estimate and replacing it with its sweetness right. This is the most blatant, as it alters the overall theme and structure of the poem. This last edit changes the entire theme of the poem. The original wording allows some ambiguity and a surface meaning of, you don't know what you've got till it's gone. However, its sweetness right changes that theme to a sentimental reminiscing, more likely acceptable to the audiences of the time. This alternative also changed the slant rhyme that Emily Dickinson is currently known for into a more traditional ABCB. This affects Dickinson's story by making her fall under the umbrella of other female poets of the time. Finally, as she did with hundreds of other poems, Todd added a title. She chose Last Joy to fit her reworking of the second stanza, taking a poem with multiple layers and turning it into a sentimental musing. And while it seems like this would be the origin of multiple versions of the poem, this was the only version for decades, no matter what the original manuscript said. Consequently, Dickinson's story and reputation were greatly affected by these changes, making her out to be a traditional female poet as opposed to a trailblazer of modernism. Amazingly, it wasn't until over 50 years after initial publication, and almost 70 years after Dickinson's death, when the original manuscript version was revisited for a new transcription and analysis. Thomas Johnson, for his 1955 collection, The Poems of Emily Dickinson, went back to her original manuscripts as opposed to relying on Mabel Loomis Todd's Last Joy. This version, published 90 years after the initial manuscript was written, actually began the era of two versions of this poem. Johnson did not add in any additional punctuation, which seems a minor change, but it was revolutionary as it rewrote Dickinson's story. Instead of being a traditional 19th century female poet, her punctuation sets her apart as a modernist. However, even despite going back to the original manuscript, Johnson couldn't resist fixing one thing: the spelling of height in the second stanza. This was unusual practice for Johnson, as he did not correct the spelling in all Dickinson's poems. However, it affects her story because it adds more traditional elements to her sometimes untraditional poems. The most recent editorial decisions were made in R. W. Franklin's 1998 collections, The Poems of Emily Dickinson, which just so happens to be one of our textbooks. He went back to the original manuscript as well, but did not make any changes to the original text as he interpreted Dickinson's writing, including leaving her misspelling of height. This reflects a purist attitude of editing, most likely in the belief that the best way to read Dickinson is through the manuscripts. By leaving the misspelling, Franklin is accepting Dickinson as she was, letting her story be told only by her own words. So, with all these different versions of the same 8-line poem, which is the correct one, and how does it affect Emily Dickinson's story? You can choose whose editorial principles align the most closely with your own, which kind of makes you an editor in your own right. So, what is Emily Dickinson's story? Who gets to tell it? As an editor yourself, you do.